When the battleship Bismarck entered service, it was more than a weapon. It was a statement. Nazi Germany presented the ship as proof that it could challenge British dominance at sea, a domain long associated with imperial power and global control. Steel, scale, and firepower, Bismarck embodied ambition. It was designed not merely to fight, but to intimidate, to announce that the balance of naval power could be rewritten. Strategically, Bismarck represented a shift in German naval thinking. Germany did not seek open fleet engagements with the Royal Navy, whose numbers remained overwhelming. Instead, ships like Bismarck were intended as commerce raiders, fast, heavily armed platforms capable of breaking into the Atlantic and threatening supply lines that sustained Britain's war effort. The ship's value lay as much in the disruption it could cause as in any battle it might fight. Its construction reflected this dual purpose. Bismarck combined heavy armour with high speed, allowing it to survive encounters long enough to escape unfavourable engagements. Its guns could outmatch most opponents it was likely to encounter, while its range gave it access to vast operational spaces. In theory, a single successful sortie could force the Royal Navy to divert enormous resources to counter it. Beyond strategy, the ship carried immense symbolic weight. For the Nazi regime, Bismarck was propaganda afloat. It was named after Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unification, linking modern military power to national mythology. Photographs, ceremonies, and press coverage emphasized the ship's size and modernity, framing it as a symbol of technological mastery and national resurgence. This symbolism also imposed pressure. A ship so heavily invested with meaning could not be treated as expendable. Its deployment carried political risk alongside military risk. Failure would resonate far beyond naval circles. Success, on the other hand, promised a psychological victory, undermining British confidence and reinforcing the image of German inevitability. For Britain, this made Bismarck uniquely threatening even before it fired a shot. The Royal Navy understood that allowing such a vessel freedom of movement would endanger convoys and morale alike. The ship's mere presence in the Atlantic would force defensive reactions across thousands of miles. Thus, Bismarck was not just a target, it was a problem that had to be solved quickly and decisively. Within the Kriegsmarine itself, Bismarck occupied an uneasy position. Germany's navy lacked the infrastructure and numbers to support sustained surface operations. The ship's success depended on coordination, timing, and luck. Its power was undeniable, but it operated within constraints that limited how boldly it could be used. This tension between capability and reality defined its mission from the outset. As Bismarck prepared for its first major operation, it carried the weight of expectation from multiple directions: strategic, political, and symbolic. It was meant to prove that Germany could challenge Britain on the open ocean. What followed would show how fragile that ambition was when confronted by a determined enemy willing to commit everything to the hunt. The moment Bismarck slipped into the North Atlantic, the war at sea entered a sharper, more dangerous phase. This was not simply a deployment, it was a test of whether Germany could project surface power beyond coastal waters and into the arteries that kept Britain alive. Every mile westward expanded the ship's potential impact, turning open ocean into a field of uncertainty for Allied planners. The Atlantic was not empty space. It was a moving network of convoys carrying food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons, supplies without which Britain could not continue the war. German naval strategy understood this vulnerability well. Submarines were already waging a relentless campaign, but a battleship like Bismarck represented a different kind of threat. Sudden, overwhelming force capable of annihilating convoys in minutes rather than weeks. Breaking into the Atlantic required more than speed. It demanded secrecy, timing, and favourable weather. Narrow passages between Iceland, Greenland, and Norway acted as choke points where detection was likely. The success of the mission depended on slipping through these gaps before British patrols could respond. Every delay increased the risk of interception, and once detected, escape would be uncertain. For the German command, the objective was not prolonged combat but disruption. Bismarck was meant to force the Royal Navy into reaction, stretching its resources across vast distances. Even the rumour of its presence could divert escorts, delay convoys, and create hesitation. The battleship did not need to sink dozens of ships to succeed. It needed to make Britain feel exposed. From the British perspective, this potential was intolerable. Britain's survival depended on predictable movement across the sea. A single hostile capital ship roaming the Atlantic could shatter that predictability. Convoys might reroute, slow down, or scatter. Insurance, planning, and morale all suffered when certainty disappeared. The Atlantic, already dangerous, threatened to become chaotic. The scale of response reflected this fear. Once Bismarck's breakout was suspected, British naval forces mobilized with urgency. Ships were redirected, patrol patterns tightened, and air reconnaissance intensified. The hunt began not because Bismarck had already done catastrophic damage, but because of what it might do if left unchecked. For Bismarck's crew, the Atlantic offered both opportunity and isolation. Far from friendly ports and air cover, success would depend on endurance and coordination. Each day at sea increased exposure to tracking and interception. The same vastness that offered freedom also removed margin for error. There would be no easy retreat. The breakout thus transformed the battleship from a symbol into an active threat. Steel ambition met strategic reality. As Bismarck pushed into the Atlantic, it carried with it not just guns and armour, but the power to reshape naval priorities across an entire ocean. What followed would determine whether that power could be sustained, or whether the ocean would become a trap. The Denmark Strait was a narrow, unforgiving corridor between Greenland and Iceland, where cold seas and shifting weather compressed fleets into close proximity. It was here, in the early hours of May 1941, that the Bismarck's breakout into the Atlantic was violently interrupted. What had been a campaign of stealth and anticipation suddenly became a moment of direct confrontation. Visibility was poor and the sea restless. Mist and low cloud reduced clarity, forcing commanders to make decisions with incomplete information. In such conditions, radar contacts and silhouette recognition carried enormous weight. The encounter was not planned as a decisive battle by either side. It emerged from intersecting patrol routes and urgency on both commands to seize initiative. For the British, this first contact carried immediate symbolic importance. Intercepting Bismarck before it could scatter into the Atlantic was essential. Allowing it to escape would mean weeks of uncertainty and danger for convoys. Thus, engagement in the Strait was not merely tactical, it was preventative, driven by the fear of what delay might allow. The opening moments were shaped by misidentification and hesitation. In the low light, outlines blurred and assumptions guided, targeting choices. Decisions made in seconds would determine outcomes felt across the entire campaign. The battle did not begin with certainty, but with interpretation of shapes, distances, and intent. Once guns opened fire, restraint vanished. Heavy shells cut through mist and water with terrifying speed. The confined geography of the strait removed the option of easy disengagement. Both sides were forced into commitment, aware that turning away too early could be catastrophic. The encounter escalated rapidly from contact to combat. For Bismarck, this was the first test of its design under real pressure. Its guns, armour, and fire control systems moved from theory into consequence. The ship was no longer a distant threat. It was an active combatant asserting presence through fire. Yet with this assertion came exposure. Engaging meant being tracked, observed, and fixed in enemy awareness. For the British ships, the encounter confirmed both the danger and the necessity of the hunt. Facing Bismarck directly revealed how costly failure could be, but also how essential immediate action was. The engagement in the Denmark Strait stripped away abstraction. The war at sea, previously defined by possibility, now had a specific location, a visible enemy, and irreversible momentum. The first contact did not resolve the campaign, but it defined it. From this moment on, Bismarck could no longer slip quietly into the Atlantic. The strait marked the transition from pursuit to confrontation, from strategy to consequence. What followed would unfold under the pressure created here, in cold waters where distance vanished and decisions became permanent. The destruction of HMS Hood unfolded with shocking speed. Within moments of the engagement in the Denmark Strait, a ship that had symbolised British naval power for a generation was reduced to fire, smoke, and absence. The scale of the loss was not measured only in tonnage or casualties, but in disbelief. Observers struggled to process how something so familiar, so permanent, could vanish almost instantly. Hood had carried a legacy that extended far beyond its hull. It was a visible reminder of Britain's maritime identity. A ship that had visited ports across the empire and embodied continuity between wars. Its presence reassured allies and warned rivals. When it exploded and broke apart, and that reassurance shattered. The sea closed over a chapter of naval history in minutes. The violence of the loss amplified its impact. There was no prolonged duel, no gradual retreat, no time for adaptation. One catastrophic hit transformed the battle. For the crews watching from nearby ships, the event was both personal and incomprehensible. Training did not prepare sailors for the sudden disappearance of a flagship and nearly all those aboard it. News of the sinking travelled faster than analysis. In Britain, the shock resonated immediately. The war at sea, often distant and abstract to civilians, suddenly felt intimate. The loss was not framed as a tactical setback, but as a national wound. Questions followed quickly, but answers lagged behind grief. For the Royal Navy, the implications were severe. The engagement demonstrated that prestige could not substitute for protection, and that modern naval warfare punished assumptions mercilessly. Confidence had to be rebuilt under pressure, with an enemy still at large and newly emboldened by success. The destruction of Hood transformed the pursuit of Bismarck from a strategic necessity into a moral imperative. Winston Churchill's directive, simple, direct, and uncompromising, captured the mood of the moment. This was no longer a hunt governed solely by doctrine. It became a national demand for resolution. British naval resources were mobilized with urgency. Ships were diverted from other duties. Patrol areas expanded, and reconnaissance intensified. The objective was no longer containment, but elimination. Allowing Bismarck to escape after destroying Hood was unthinkable. The psychological balance of the naval war depended on response. The pursuit unfolded across a vast and hostile ocean. Weather, distance, and uncertainty complicated every decision. Bismarck's movements were intermittent and often inferred rather than observed. Each lost contact raised the fear that the ship might vanish into the Atlantic, free to strike convoys at will. For the crews involved, the order carried immense pressure. This was not a routine operation. Failure would echo far beyond the fleet. Every miscalculation risked not only further loss, but a collapse in confidence. The pursuit demanded endurance as much as speed. Days of tension punctuated by brief, decisive moments. At the same time, the chase exposed the limits of control. Even with superior numbers, the Royal Navy faced an adversary operating at the edge of reach. Air reconnaissance, surface tracking, and chance all played roles. The hunt became a test of coordination under uncertainty, where success depended on persistence rather than brilliance. The language surrounding the pursuit reflected its emotional charge. Bismarck was no longer described only as a battleship, but as a threat that had to be answered. The ship's earlier symbolic power now worked against it. What it represented for Germany intensified the determination to destroy it. As the pursuit tightened, the narrative of the campaign shifted. The loss of Hood remained a wound, but it also became a catalyst. The Royal Navy's response aimed, not to erase the past minutes in the Denmark Strait, but to ensure they were not repeated. The order to sink Bismarck was about restoring balance, strategic, psychological, and symbolic, on the open sea. After the violence of the Denmark Strait, Bismarck did not sail triumphantly onward. It withdrew, damaged, leaking, and suddenly vulnerable. The ship that had shattered HMS Hood now faced a different reality. Fuel was lost through ruptured tanks, speed was compromised, and the promise of freedom in the Atlantic narrowed with every mile. Yet for a brief, dangerous window, the battleship vanished from sight. This disappearance transformed the hunt into something far more unsettling. A damaged enemy is often more dangerous than a confident one, because its intentions become opaque. Was Bismarck heading for France, seeking repair and safety under Luftwaffe cover? Or was it attempting to break contact entirely, resume commerce raiding? British commanders could not be certain, and uncertainty bred anxiety. The ocean amplified this tension. Weather closed in, visibility dropped, and radio silence erased clues. Vast distances turned small navigational changes into strategic mysteries. The Atlantic, which had once constrained Bismarck's movement, now sheltered it. For hours at a time, the most powerful naval force in the world was searching empty water. For the Royal Navy, losing contact was more than a setback. It was a psychological shock layered on top of recent trauma. The loss of Hood demanded resolution, and yet the enemy had slipped away. Each hour without contact raised the possibility that Bismarck might reach friendly ports, repair its wounds, and re-emerge as a renewed threat. The search that followed was relentless and exhausting. Ships spread across wide arcs, altering courses again and again based on fragmentary intelligence. Crews scanned the horizon continuously, aware that a single missed silhouette could change the war at sea. The hunt became an exercise in endurance rather than firepower. Aircraft took on renewed importance. Patrol planes flew long, monotonous missions over grey water, fighting fatigue, weather, and mechanical limits. Pilots searched for oil slicks, smoke, or unnatural lines on the sea, anything that might betray a wounded battleship's passage. Each flight carried the pressure of knowing that discovery if it came, would be decisive. Yet reconnaissance was imperfect. Reports conflicted. Sightings were delayed, misinterpreted, or lost to weather. Commanders faced the problem of acting too quickly on false information or too slowly on accurate intelligence. The sea offered no second chances. Decisions had to be made with incomplete pictures and irreversible consequences. At sea level, destroyers and cruisers maneuvered constantly, burning fuel and stretching crews to exhaustion. Night offered no relief. Radar contacts appeared and vanished. Tension replaced rest. The absence of the enemy became its own presence, shaping movement and thought. This phase of the hunt revealed the limits of control in modern naval warfare. Even with superior numbers, technology, and reach, the Royal Navy could not guarantee contact. Chance, weather, and human perception played roles as decisive as armour and guns. The ocean remained indifferent to urgency. When Bismarck was finally sighted again, it was not the result of flawless coordination, but of persistence intersecting with opportunity. The disappearance had not meant escape, it had meant delay. But delay was dangerous enough. Every hour lost had increased the cost of what was to come. The wounded battleship's vanishing act did not end the hunt, it intensified it. What followed would not be a question of whether Bismarck could be found, but whether it could be stopped in time. By the time the British carrier aircraft closed in on Bismarck, the contrast was almost absurd. The fairy swordfish was slow, fabric-covered, and technologically outdated, even by the standards of the early war. Against a modern battleship bristling with anti-aircraft guns, it seemed hopelessly vulnerable. Yet war often rewards what fits the moment, not what looks impressive on paper. The conditions favoured the unlikely. Low clouds, rain, and fading light limited visibility and disrupted coordinated defence. The swordfish pilots flew low and slow, skimming the sea where heavy guns struggled to track them effectively. Their very obsolescence became an advantage. They were not fast enough to overshoot targets easily, and their stability allowed precise torpedo drops under pressure. For Bismarck, this was a critical moment of exposure. Damage from earlier encounters had already narrowed its options. Steering was fragile, fuel limited, and maneuverability reduced. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but it could not form a complete shield. One torpedo struck with decisive consequence, jamming the rudder and robbing the battleship of control. That single impact changed everything. Bismarck could still fight, still fire, still absorb punishment, but it could no longer choose its direction. The ocean that had briefly hidden it now became a cage. What had been a race towards safety turned into a slow, circular drift. Escape was no longer a question of speed or luck. It was mathematically impossible. The psychological effect was immediate on both sides. For the British, the strike transformed despair into certainty. The hunt had not failed. Persistence had paid off in an unexpected way. For the German crew, the reality set in quickly. The ship was no longer maneuverable, and daylight would bring overwhelming force. When the British battleships closed in the following morning, the engagement carried a different tone from earlier encounters. There was no manoeuvring for advantage, no attempt at evasion. Bismarck fought where it was, turning its guns toward approaching enemies with discipline rather than hope. The battle was no longer about winning. It was about endurance. Shells struck repeatedly, tearing into superstructure, disabling guns and igniting fires. The ship absorbed punishment far beyond what designers had imagined, a testament to its construction and to the crew's resolve. Yet damage accumulated relentlessly. Systems failed. Communication broke down. The ability to return effective fire diminished with each hit. British ships maintained distance and method, avoiding unnecessary risk. This was not a duel, but an execution carried out with caution, born of recent loss. The memory of HMS Hood shaped every decision. No heroics were required now, only certainty. Inside Bismarck, order persisted amid destruction. Crews continued to load shells, fight fires, and tend to the wounded even as the outcome became clear. Discipline did not depend on optimism. It depended on duty. The ship's resistance was no longer strategic, but human. Eventually, the battleship was reduced to a burning, crippled hull. Its guns fell silent not because the crew surrendered, but because they could no longer function. The decision to abandon ship followed the logic of inevitability rather than defeat. Survival replaced resistance as the final objective. As Bismarck slipped beneath the waves, the Atlantic closed over one of the war's most powerful symbols. The battle ended not with a triumphant explosion, but with exhaustion and loss on both sides. The sea reclaimed the wreckage, indifferent to ideology and ambition alike. The swordfish strike and the final battle together defined the end of the hunt. A technologically modest aircraft had delivered the critical blow, and overwhelming force had finished the task. The campaign closed with a lesson that echoed far beyond 1941. In war, fate often turns not on the strongest weapon, but on the moment when vulnerability meets persistence. When Bismarck finally disappeared beneath the Atlantic, its sinking marked more than the loss of a single battleship. It signaled the collapse of an idea. For decades, naval power had been measured in armour thickness, gun caliber, and displacement. The Bismarck embodied that tradition at its highest expression. Its destruction revealed how fragile that model had become in a war defined by reach rather than size. The final moments of the ship were shaped by inevitability rather than surprise. Immobilized, isolated, and surrounded, Bismarck no longer represented offensive power. It had become a stationary target, its strength rendered irrelevant by circumstances it could not counter. The ocean that once promised freedom now offered no escape. What sank was not just steel, but a strategic assumption. For the crew, the end was experienced not as abstraction, but as collapse. Discipline held as long as it could, even when command systems failed and fire spread unchecked. The battleship did not simply cease to exist. It was dismantled piece by piece under relentless pressure. Survival replaced resistance as the final logic of action. The ship's fate was sealed not by a single blow, but by accumulated vulnerability. Strategically, the sinking sent an unmistakable message. Surface raiders operating without air superiority or nearby support could not survive sustained pursuit. The Atlantic was no longer a space where power alone guaranteed safety. Detection, coordination, and endurance now mattered more than individual strength. The Royal Navy did not defeat Bismarck by matching it ship for ship, but by refusing to let it disengage. The role of air power stood at the centre of this transformation. Aircraft, slow, limited, and seemingly fragile, had delivered the decisive constraint. They did not destroy Bismarck outright, but they removed its freedom of movement. From that moment on, the battleship's fate was determined. Control of the air had reshaped control of the sea. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate strategy. Navies around the world took notice. The era of the lone capital ship dominating the ocean was drawing to a close. Protection now depended on networks, carriers, escorts, reconnaissance, and logistics operating together. Power became distributed rather than concentrated. For Germany, the loss of Bismarck narrowed options. Surface fleet operations were reduced, and reliance on submarines increased. The risk of symbolic loss proved too great to repeat. The ship that had been meant to challenge British supremacy instead reinforced its central principle: control through coordination, not intimidation. In historical memory, Bismarck endures as both marvel and warning. Its construction reflected peak industrial ambition. Its destruction revealed the limits of that ambition in a changing war. The giant did not fall because it was weak, but because the world around it had moved on. The sinking of Bismarck thus stands as a turning point. It closed one chapter of naval warfare and opened another, where speed, information, and air power dictated outcomes. The sea remained vast and unforgiving, but it no longer belonged to the biggest ship. It belonged to those who could see farther, strike sooner, and adapt faster.